from the practical politician to the politician's advisor. As I say, the world of environmental law policy is quite a small one, and you keep meeting people you haven't seen for quite a while, so I'm really delighted to meet up again with Tom Burke, who is an environmental policy advisor, chairman of E3G, visiting professor, trustee of Green Alliance. It goes on and on. His distinction is fantastic. He's advised at the last count 3 government ministers on the environment, and we're really fortunate to Tom, who's going to address the point which was actually raised in a question earlier today. His talk is entitled TTIP, Climate Change Catastrophe, so we're really pleased to have you here to talk to us this afternoon. Thank you very much.
You. It's always slightly disconcerting, especially when you get to my age, to have somebody introduce you by reading out a kind of foretaste of your obituary.
Wasn't intended that way.
As William said, I've been around in the environmental community for a very long time now. I was adding up, it's about 40 odd years since I first started working at Friends of the Earth, and it's kind of a pleasure really to be talking to an audience of environmental lawyers. One of the unintended consequences of all of that was to change something about environmental lawyers, not just the law. There were no environmental lawyers when I set out, none at all, and it's really amazing to see that actually, whatever else we have, we managed to get a lot of environmental lawyers, and I'm sure the world is a better place for that. I thought I'd do two things this afternoon. I thought I'd say a little bit about why catastrophe, not that I actually chose that word myself, but actually there is a very real sense in what's happening as a catastrophe. It's a sort of slow motion catastrophe, but it's not the wrong word. So I'll say a little bit about climate change and what's driving climate change, and then I'll introduce you to the mysteries of TTIP's Regulatory Cooperation Council and show why that's probably not going to help us deal with climate change very much and may actually make it harder. Climate change is a very interesting problem because we know exactly what's causing it. We know exactly what we've got to do and where we've got to get to in order to retain a climate we can all live in, a climate in which the change at least remains manageable. And that's now got a very precise number on it. We have to keep the world's eventual rise in the average temperature around the globe to below 2 degrees centigrade. Now, lots of people talk about that as a target. That's because they're not keeping up to date with what's actually happened in the climate negotiations. It's an obligation. Every government in the world has undertaken as a formal obligation in the UN Framework Climate Convention to work to avoid dangerous climate change. And when the governments of the world in Cancun agreed that 2 degrees was the, as it were, threshold of dangerous climate change, it turned a target into an obligation. Obligations are rather more important to than targets. Targets you can change and move, and we'll probably hear a lot of people as we run up to the meetings in Paris at the end of this year suggest that we're really not going to achieve 2 degrees, we should change the target. Actually, you can't change obligations just like that. And just in case you're thinking about it, any government that wished to change the obligation would first of all have to propose why going above 2 was now no longer dangerous. They'd find that quite difficult to do. So we're stuck with, or committed to, I don't mind which one you choose, we're stuck to or committed to 2 degrees as the goal. That's where we've got to get to. We're going to keep the temperature rise below 2 degrees, or we will progressively end up with an unmanageable climate in which, by the way, one of the things that really gets talked about in this context, one of the things that will be most at risk in a world that is above 2 degrees is the rule of law itself. As when you start thinking about icebergs melting and ice sheets melting and catastrophic or damaging weather events, extreme weather events, and so on. They're only the sort of, as it were, the symptoms of what a climate change really means. And I'll say a bit more about that in a second. But the rule of law matters a lot to me, because there isn't any way we could protect the environment in any of its dimensions unless we're able to maintain the rule of law. The fossil fuel industry, the fact that the fossil fuel industry only exists because we buy its products. If we didn't buy its products, it wouldn't exist. But the fossil fuel industry is the cause of climate change, just as we are the cause of climate change by using its products. It projects a future for itself. All of the various reports that have come out, actually quite a lot of them in the last few weeks, talk about a bright future for the fossil fuel industry. Oil and gas will be using about 2/3 more than we're using today by 2050. And all those people, and we've just heard the Chief Executive of Shell in effect say, all those people who want to stop us doing that are immoral because they're preventing poor people from getting access to the energy you need to have a good life. I mean, when you hear somebody using that kind of argument and you suspect you are in the presence of a bully who's trying to bully you into agreeing with him, you're quite right. That really is just bullying, and it's kind of bizarre attempt by an industry that has some really important questions to answer to try to put itself on the right side. Now, its projections, 2/3 more, happy future, keep your investments, are all going to be safe. It won't happen. It's not actually going to happen. It's a very interesting thing. When you look at those models on which they've based it, they're all, none of them have factor in any impact of a rising temperature on economic growth. So in all of those models, you have population goes up, demand goes up, production goes up, the temperature goes up, and everything's all right. Except it's not all right, because all of that growth is entirely dependent on rising real incomes of the bottom 2 quartiles of the urban populations in emerging economies. Unless poor people get wealthier, unless they prosper, that growth will not happen. But those are exactly the people, as the temperature goes from its current almost 1 to 2 over the next 20, 30 years and beyond 2 after that, if the fossil fuel industry has its way, those are exactly the incomes that are destroyed by food price spikes, by water price spikes, by extreme weather events. There's no growth in Tacloban 2 years after that hurricane took it apart. There will not be any growth in Vanuatu for a very, very long time. Earlier this year, there was a tanker hijacked by an armed gang in Sao Paulo. Anybody like to guess what was in the tanker? Water. Water. And start to think, we've only barely got to 1. Start to think what will be happening around the world and to the incomes of poor people on whom the growth depends if we get beyond 2. So we've got a really kind of tricky problem. Your growth will end up, if it happens for the fossil fuel industries, will end up eating your climate, but your climate will get its own back by eating your growth. That's a real dilemma. A real dilemma is one in which there are 2 horns. If you choose one of the horns, the other horn gets you. If you choose neither of the horns, which is what governments tend to do when faced with a dilemma, both horns get you. If you want to actually deal with a dilemma, you have to step out from between the horns of the dilemma, and that's imagination, innovation, ingenuity, investment. That's what gets you out from between the horns of the dilemma. And those are exactly the kind of prospects that are increasingly being taken up. But what's going to impede them is the $600 billion that the oil industry plans to invest over the next 10 years in producing more oil, gas, or fossil fuels. There's a real collision between staying below 2 and the investment that's already being made by the oil companies. Now, Amelia was commenting about multinational corporations. I promise you, they're the good boys in this, but they actually aren't the main promoters of oil and gas. The main promoters of oil and gas are national governments of one kind or another. The Saudi government, the Kazakh government, the Russian mafia who own the government in Russia. Just to put a little perspective on that, the Russian mafia government have invested $128 billion in oil developments in eastern Siberia, which have not yet generated any revenues. If we're going to deal with climate change, we're essentially going to have to take away the money, the benefit of all that money. So we need to get real about what we are taking on here. The reason I'm citing those numbers is that the oil industry and all of the people who cluster around that industry, the oil, gas, fossil fuel industry, they are not going to go away. They are going to fight back. They're not going to give up and say, okay, we surrender, we don't want the climate to change. And they will fight back by a lot of means, but in particular, they will use every opportunity created in law to fight back. And that's why TTIP comes in, because what's worrying a lot of people about TTIP is it will create more opportunities for people like the oil industry to fight back against higher environmental standards, against achieving that world below 2 degrees that we need to get to. And that's why I now have to, having had some fun telling you about climate change and how easy it's going to be to deal with it, why I have to introduce you to the mysteries of TTIP and its Regulatory Cooperation Council. So if you look at what governments can do, what we can all do together with governments to address and deal with climate change, what comes top of the list from lots of people these days is put a price on carbon. Well, we're talking about making a major transformation in an industry that invests in the scale, our energy industry I've just talked about, and doing that within 40 years. In other words, we're looking at a massive transformation. We're not looking at small changes. Now, why would you ever think that a marginal price tool would bring about transformational change? It's just a nonsense. I mean, a lot of businessmen now signing up to it because it sounds as if it would be painful. Putting a price on something, gosh, that hurts. Therefore, it must be good for us. Therefore, it was doing good. Actually, it's pretty much nonsense. A price on carbon will it will make change at the margin. That's fine, good, let's accept that, but it isn't actually going to achieve what you need to achieve. The other thing that can be done is to spend a lot of money on investment. Well, especially if you do put a tax on carbon, you can generate lots of revenues that you could spend, but there's an enormous range of other calls on public investment, and if you can't put the private investment put the public investment in, much harder to get the private investment going in the right direction. So we can do more with investment than we can with putting a price on carbon, but that's still going to leave an enormous amount to be done. And that gap has got to be filled with regulations of a whole variety of kinds. It's got to be filled with regulations on products, on technologies, on markets, how the electricity markets work, how you write the regulations for the operation of the electricity market will be very important. How you write the regulations about what the content of various fuels should be is going to be very important. What kind of technologies you do or don't allow to be deployed, and the rules that you do for allowing, all of that will make an enormous difference. And all of that, potentially, all of those different kinds of regulation, whether they're financial regulations, say technical regulations, all kinds of regulations, all of it potentially come under the scope of TTIP. And TTIP, in some way, has to deal with those. So, TTIP, Transatlantic Trade and Investment Program. That's such a wonderfully nice sound to it. Sounds sort of thing you'd really want to have. And the trade community deeply puzzled about why there is so much objection to it. Well, you know, lots of people didn't see trade liberalization doing a lot for them when the economy was working pretty well. But now that the economy is not doing very much for people's wages, it's even harder for people to see what's the point of liberalizing trade, of taking whatever prices or risks that are involved in that to liberalize trade even more. We're not so sure anymore that globalization really is good for the economy, let alone anything else. And it's kind of interesting that the people promoting TTIP is still entirely concerned to say it will give you more money, therefore you must have it. Again, more of that kind of bullying thing. And if you stand up, you're against people having more economic prosperity, therefore you're a bad person. And that's a real failure of the trade politicians, the trade policymakers, to understand that they've really not made the case for why you want to increase trade in a sort of broad political way at all. And when they come to looking at TTIP, and this particular bit of TTIP, which is called Building Regulatory Coherence, how to reduce the friction between regulations being different, they, by and large, have thought about that entirely in terms of product standards. In other words, how do you get mutual recognition for the way in which you measure how much of a particular compound is in food, or how much is present in a product that is on, how much of a chemical is present in a product that's on sale to the public. They've not begun to think through, and there's no evidence in any of the stuff I've seen on the TTIP debate, that they've actually thought about how much more difficult environmental regulation is to actually fit inside that framework. I mean, and in particular, how different the cultures of building environmental regulation across the Atlantic are. These are very different regulatory cultures. And I'll take you through a bit of just how different that is. In the European Union, we make environmental regulations. It takes a long time to do it. We spend about 10 years or so, typically, to get a piece of legislation through. And it's an enormously consultative process. Everybody gets involved. The Commission consults with everybody, the Parliament has a say, the national governments have a say, and we go round and round and round over all those periods of enormous consultation. So by the time you actually get a piece of legislation agreed by the Commission, the Parliament, and the Member States, it's a very broadly based political consensus that has arrived at that piece of legislation. You can't intervene late in the day to change it. If you look at what the American legislative process is, any member of Congress can introduce a bill, a piece of federal legislation, whenever they like, at any moment. They don't have to consult with anybody before they introduce the legislation. They write a bill and they go out and they set out to build the votes from other congressmen to support that bill going through. And what that's generated is a process in which actually massive investment goes into intervening very late in the process with the lobbyists from K Street to just get the text to read exactly right. So you have one thing that's built on a broad national consensus, and you have another set of legislative instruments that have been built up essentially by some sort of agglomeration of interests. And as people often say, really depends on who spends the most money in the US. So you start from a kind of very different base, and then you make that a lot more complicated, because in the European tradition, you give the regulators a lot of discretion about how to apply the legislation. As long as they follow due process, they don't cheat or lie about how they are implementing the law, they have an enormous amount of discretion to interpret what the legislative instrument means in each of the context in which it applies. In the United States, that is definitely not the case. Regulators have no discretion. What American environmental legislation does is it mandates an agency to create rules which cover every single context in which the law applies. So they have to create a rule-making process in which they consult with everybody, they write rules and draft rules, and then if people don't like the rules, if they think their interests have not been properly dealt with by the rule-making regulator, then they go to court, and it ends up with the judges deciding exactly what the rule meant. And they do it not for the rule as a whole, but for each of the specific contexts in which the which the legislation applies. So you have really a difference where in the European context, the regulators essentially determine what the legislation meant, and in the American context, the courts determine what the legislation meant. Now that's really difficult culture to combine to cooperate across. And then thirdly, the European legislation is based on a precautionary principle. And what the precautionary principle says in effect is, look, you don't have to have absolute proof that something needs to be done to do it. You just have to take a precaution, because what matters is protect the outcome. Protecting the environment is what matters most. In the US framework, as you assess the impact, as you do these impact assessments, you're required by law to make sure that you only create rules in which the economic benefit of applying the rule outweigh the economic costs of applying the rule. So in the European system, the environmental outcome takes primacy. In the American system, the economic outcomes take primacy. Now, the whole idea of creating regulatory coherence, one of the central principles of TTIP, regulatory, is that you somehow have got to merge these two different systems. In fact, it's quite interesting what they say. The Commission's proposal says regulatory coherence will be achieved using early consultations on significant regulations, use of impact assessment, evaluations, periodic review of existing regulatory measures, and application of good regulatory practices. That's what they're setting out to do. Well, I'm a bit puzzled about how you have early consultation across these two systems, one of which has a very long period of pre-legislative consultations and one of which has a very long period of post-legislative consultations. So I'm not sure how you achieve that. I'm not sure how you achieve convergence between a system that uses primarily economic factors determining the impact and a system that primarily focuses on the environmental or health outcomes in determining the outcome. Now, all of that complexity, of course, is recognized. Yeah, it's very difficult. So what we will do is we'll just agree the principles, and we will set up a mechanism called a Regulatory Cooperation Council. And the Regulatory will sort out the detail of doing this. And the Regulatory Cooperation Council in normal trade practice will be a group of experts and maybe some businessmen who will meet in secret, and they will decide how all this is to be done in practice. And that's the bit that really scares people. That what happens is you take all these complex and difficult issues out of the headlines, you take them out of the public eye, you bury them in some institution that nobody's ever heard of that meets in secret and changes things without anybody noticing. And that's what scares people. It scares people not so much because it can undo things that have already been passed into law, but it scares people because this will be used preemptively in order to create, to make sure that you don't write new laws that somehow can't be applicable on both sides of the Atlantic. Well, just on climate change, just one very simple example of how difficult that will be in practice. The European law, legislation on climate, puts a cap on the amount of carbon, that greenhouse gases actually, that the whole of the European economy can emit. And that's why we have a trading system and all the rest of it. The federal government has no powers to put a cap on the amount of greenhouse gas emissions that the US economy can emit. So a Regulatory Cooperation Council is supposed to reconcile this difference and do it in secret and do it with technical experts. I don't think this has got a prayer of winning public confidence. But it also pushes trade policy much further out. Trade policy originally is about reducing tariffs on goods. That's its traditional scope. And when you do that with trade policy, you're basically choosing who wins and who loses. And there's a good argument for having some level of secrecy about how governments do that, because otherwise you get round up a great public rows before you'd even agreed anything. So I can see why you need, and a lot of that stuff will in any case be involve commercially confidential information. I can't see any reason at all why you should do that about regulatory cooperation. There's absolutely no reason in the 21st century why. First of all of the negotiations and all of the papers for the negotiations should be up on a wiki somewhere. Everybody should be able to see them. Because without that level of transparency, I don't think there's any prayer of getting public concern. But also, there's no reason at all why all the meetings or whatever committee you set up and whatever subcommittees it set up, why all of that shouldn't be completely in public. Every bit of it. Even webinar broadcasting the meetings. I don't see why you can't do that. There's no good argument for... So you have a test about whether governments and whether the Commission and the American government are serious about doing something that will produce maybe some marginal benefits, or whether what they're really doing is something that has a lot of scope and opportunity for mischief making by companies that don't want to move in the direction that we need to move. What do I think? My own sense is the Commission, probably quite a lot of people, really do think that they're trying to do something that, you know, if you reduce the cost of applying regulations by reducing the sort of friction between different regulation sets, then you can get better outcomes. I mean, I can see that sort of argument. I suspect, however, the law of unintended consequences is actually being applied here, and that in practice none of this has been thought through well enough to get a good outcome, which is why I'm pretty sceptical and gave evidence to the Environmental Audit Committee about why I'm sceptical, that if we're not careful, this kind of instrument could end up becoming a barrier to achieving our success on climate change policy, and then make a catastrophe on the climate more likely. Thank you.
Thanks, really, Tom. That's a lovely presentation, very, very lively, and for me encapsulated exactly what the issue is. We have this clash of cultures, and you described it as a merger. I mean, I'm not quite sure whether that's the right metaphor. Possibly some grotesque kind of genetic experiment. We take the DNA from a giraffe and we combine it with that of a hedgehog, and we speculate on what kind of animal might be the result of this combination. It's a bit like that.
It is a bit like that. It's, in a sense, it's a focus on the text. So you have both animals got 4 feet. That's like, it's the text where the words look the same, but the text actually operates completely differently. The same text operates completely differently in different cultures, and I think the trade policymakers are paying no attention to that, and they're doing it on an issue that's beyond their normal bounds of responsibility. So, you know, the trade commissioners are not environmental experts. The State Department and the Department of Commerce who do this in the United States are not full of environmental experts. So there's real problems about the way and who's involved in making these negotiations actually work in a way that delivers benefits rather than ends up creating obstacles.
And certainly that outcome I just find really scary, but maybe somebody's got something else to add here which will reassure me. Do people wish, there's a hand being raised at the front here, one of our organising committee.
Hi, I don't know if this is on, but yes, I'm one of the organising committee. I'm Rebecca.
Rebecca, is it switched on?
It is. I think so.
Is it? Okay. So I wondered if you could identify any possible benefits of TTIP for climate change regulation.
Eloquent silence. If you could make regulatory cooperation work, and if you could so write the ISDS provisions that it would not allow for mischievous actions by governments, then you could get some small improvements. Whether they're worth the effort, I think, is really questionable. In other words, whether the economic benefits and the improvements in the operation of regulations, outcomes in the real world, would really be that significantly different, I don't know. I'm pretty damn suspicious of the models, the economic models that are used to say this will create a lot of largesse. I already pointed out why I've got some doubts about economic models being used to assess energy futures. I think the models that look beyond a few months, maybe a year at most, on the economy, and we've seen are pretty ropey. So I mean, they're nothing like as good as climate models. Look at how much doubt there is about those. So I'm pretty skeptical there'll be a lot of benefits. I think there's a lot of symbology involved in this. I think we have to have a world that trades, and so I think there have to be trade rules. And I think we have to have good trade rules that work and that people subscribe to. I think pushing them out beyond their traditional province is very risky. And we're already seeing how difficult it is even within the bounds of normal trade rules, like the Doha round, and how that's run into real problems in trying to manage agricultural trade and agricultural goods. You know, and I think we do better to focus our effort on getting the existing trade rules to work well. In a world of 8 billion people, mostly living in cities, you're not going to be having a lot of fun if we don't have a lot of trade internationally. So I'm up for getting good trade rules. I just think this is pushing them too far.
Hi, my name is Ivana Dimitrova. My question is about fracking, and do you think that TTIP would actually lead to an increase in the use of fracking in the US and the EU? And also, I believe in 2014 a memo was leaked between EU and US officials where they sought to make it easier for both sides to grant export licenses for crude oil, fossil fuels and natural gas. Are you aware if this is still on the table?
I'm not aware of whether this is still on the table, but the issue that you're raising, which is not just about fracking, but it's also, in relation to TTIP, is not just about fracking, it's also about tar sands. And the big issue is the carbon content of fuels, and whether that there should be free trade in high carbon fuels that come, particularly for tar sands, more so than fracked oil. And there's been a great row because Europe at one point wanted to impose fuel standard rows that would have kept tar sands out of the European market. And that's been a huge contretemps between the Canadians in particular, but also the Americans and the EU. And so far, they have been, the European governments have been bending to that pressure from America. Now, one of the reasons they've been bending is because we've looked at what's happened on fracking and said, wow, all that cheap stuff, we want to get our hands on it here, because otherwise, and quite a lot of this is specious, otherwise it puts our businesses at a competitive disadvantage. Well, not too sure about that. But so the reason it's become an issue in the way you describe is because we want the Americans to allow the export of fracked oil, and the North Americans want us to allow carbon-heavy tar sands and oil sands fuels into Europe. And that's exactly the kind of bargain that, in a way, brings trade rules into disrepute, because it's a straightforward political bargain. It's very hard to justify that there's a lot of benefit in that, really, for people, particularly if you then take on the consequences of that for the climate. And so the climate argument now says, well, hang on, why are we trying to make all this easier when we're trying to really slow down the use of these things? What is the point of making it easier through the trade rules for this sort of trade to take place? And I must say, governments have not come up with a very good answer on either side of the Atlantic to that question. So, and we're not going to do any fracking here, by the way, just the other side of that. And the idea that we will be fracking for gas or oil anytime this decade is pretty unrealistic. Works in the headlines, though.
Last couple of questions.
Thank you very much. James Hewitt, I work independently. The European Commission, I understand, has decided that burning wood in large power stations is carbon neutral and there's no carbon debt. And Drax, the big power station in the UK, is buying a very large amount of wood pellets from the USA. Drax is owned by a US company, an investment manager, and most of the pellets are supplied by the same sorts of people. I would imagine this would be one of the first TTIP cases when, and I hope that it does very soon, the UK and the EU say that we shouldn't be burning wood in big power stations.
I mean, biomass is difficult, and it was a sort of, we got ourselves into a sort of bad position on policy 20 years ago by thinking that biomass was a good idea and not thinking it through. I don't think it's a particularly attractive idea to import wood for power stations, but I think we should be moving as fast as we possibly can away from large power stations anyway into much more distributed generation. So I'm not sure that that particular problem has a long life. I'm much more concerned about the massive amount of support and the requirements to include biomass in transport fuels, which I think is a more serious consequences for the environment than the wood chip industry. So if I'm scaling the sort of problems, the particular one, I don't see a big scope for growth in biomass for electricity generation. I don't think it should be happening, but it's not the issue I put first. I would want us to get out of the idea that you're producing ethanol to put in transport fuel, and you're turning large areas of land over to production of those fuels, which I think is really much more worrying. In that case too, I think we should be moving far faster and investing in moving far faster to electric vehicles. My own sense of where we're going with battery storage and with renewable electricity is we're not that far away from the point at which that's going to make an awful lot of sense. I just read the other day that the Chinese city of Shenzhen, that's the big bit near Hong Kong, has just decided to spend £800 million over the next 5 years, $800 million over the next 5 years in promoting electric vehicles in China. And if the Chinese do to electric vehicles what they did to solar panels, we'll soon be driving, within 10 to 15 years, we'll all be driving around in electric vehicles. So again, really much more important, in my view, to focus on what you want to do rather than on stopping what you shouldn't do. I certainly don't want to make it easier through the trade rules to do the things we shouldn't be doing.
Kate Hodgson, Haldane Society for Socialist Lawyers. Thank you very much. Hugely helpful presentation. This morning we heard about CETA, and my question is, are we too late about CETA? And someone, that's the Canadian sort of equivalent.
Oh, yeah, sorry, yes.
Maybe I'm pronouncing it wrong because I only heard about it today. And a brilliant suggestion from the floor that what about a challenge through the Aarhus Convention, and I just wondered whether you had any ideas about that.
I don't. I haven't followed that piece. I've been following this specifically because it's something I know about, the regulatory coherence piece. I haven't been following the wider issue enough to add anything to what you heard this morning. Should we use every means we can on every issue to create transparency? Yes, and we should make more use of our use. I think we've neglected a bit in this country on a number of issues.
Coincidentally, yeah. Tom, the lady who raised the Aarhus question before had the microphone. Emily, did you want to come back on that? Ask the question.
No, please. I mean,
again,
talk to the person who knows
this been
about it.
Raised.
Sorry, what did you want to ask about the Aarhus Convention specifically? I mean,
the point you made earlier.
Tom's experience, whether he had any view, whether that would be
not been involved.
CETA, whether we're too late. Have we missed the boat with CETA?
Well, I would have thought, unless the government, because there's an election coming up in Canada quite shortly as well, if Harper stays in, then we're probably stuffed. But if somebody else gets in, but there doesn't seem to be a particular person at the moment who's really going to get in, then we may have a chance of unseating it. But in Canada, it's very bad news for the environment at the moment. In terms of Aarhus, the thing that I brought up earlier about it was that it's under, there's a provision in the Aarhus Convention for public participation in environmental decision making, and that's from the beginning of the process right to the end of the process. And clearly what I've heard, and I know very little about TTIP until today, is it appears that there's been very little public participation from the very outset. So I would have thought it's something worth investigating, but that's all I can say.
And the Canadians, obviously, the big drivers of that bargain about access, about US oil being exportable and Canadian tar sands oil being importable into Europe. That's the bargain that the trade people are trying to strike. So I guess that question is quite important, but I don't know much about where we are in the process.
Professor Nicholas de Sailly.
Yes, I was interested in your comments regarding the difference as a matter of political cultures on both sides of the Atlantics. And given that I had the chance 10 years ago to take part in the unofficial rounds of consumer side of the transatlantic negotiations, I really agree with your comments. I imagine there is a bigger chance to quash federal regulations before federal US courts than before EU and national constitutional courts. I looked at the figures still a few years ago, and in the US lawyers litigating, requesting the review of President order have a 50% chance to obtain the nullification. Whereas the figure before the General Court and the Court of Justice of the European Union is somewhat 10% of success in quashing. And that means often that's just one paragraph. At national level, you got even with some jurisdictions, lower figures can amount to up to 5% of success. So whereas US lawyers are extremely successful in litigating against the regional and the state and federal governments, European public lawyers are far less successful. So that can also be added as part of the difference in.
You're quite right about that, and it's one of the things that I see as a major obstacle to getting any real level of regulatory cooperation on environmental matters, because access to the courts, as you're saying, in Europe is very limited. The system is set up in a way in which to reduce the scope of the courts by creating a very broadly based political consensus and a very deep understanding of exactly what the law means. That's what the system is set up to produce. So it limits the scope for the courts, so it doesn't matter that you don't have access to it. The idea that American companies or American NGOs would accept European standards of access to the courts is very optimistic. They're used to going to the courts and having a lot of access to the courts, and the courts having a lot of scope to interpret the legislation. Now, the underlying basis of that is, in some sense, Europe is a lawmaking culture and America is a rule-making culture. And that creates very different sets of expectations. And in a way, the courts follow the expectations and the access to the court. So getting standing before the European court is very difficult. It's very easy to get standing before the American courts. And I don't know how you overcome that obstacle to actually making the environmental laws work better together across the Atlantic. And it certainly, to my mind, is one of the safeguards, because the idea that you would get the kind of American standards of litigation against people trying to impose higher standards, the whole argument of takings, which is very important and keeps coming up in America, has no resonance at all in Europe. And so there are major culture clashes locked up inside this piece, which have not yet really been explored.
One very last quick question at the back.
Yes, hello, it's Emily Shirley again. I just wanted to ask a question about fracking. You said earlier that we would not be seeing fracking here in any shape or form in the next 10 years, and I just wanted to know why you say that.
Because we don't have, well, for lots of reasons. One, although this is very recent, because the price of oil has fallen by 50%. Two, because the geology is completely different than it is in the United States. And even if you were to have the kind of industrial infrastructure in place to do it, the costs will be a lot higher than they are in the United States. And finally, there is going to be massive public opposition to industrializing the countryside, which is what it takes. And it's one thing to talk about objecting to a single drilling site, and you can do that reasonably well, and cleaning it up after you've done your test drill. It's another thing to come up with an investable proposition, which might mean you're building a series of these pads all over the countryside, connecting them up, running them 24 hours 7, and I just don't think the public acceptability will be there. So combine the lack of any public acceptability, likelihood of public acceptability, plus the additional cost, and the government got what it really wanted out of it, which was good headlines. And that's about all I think it's going to get out of it. Now, will there be some odd places where there might be a bit of fracking? Yeah. But mainly the government's preoccupation with it was to get a headline that showed everybody that it was getting people to invest in the economy and it was making the economy work. Which, it was pretty clear. It's been very straightforward about what it was trying to make the election an issue about. And fracking was, I think, mainly about standing up that headline. We're making the country worthwhile investing in. I don't think it's got anything to do with it. And I don't know anybody in the serious players in the oil and gas industry who think that the government's obsession with fracking did anything more than slow the process down. Which is, again, the law of unintended consequences, which we've come up with.
Can I just, with regret, draw this session to a conclusion, because it's been a superb presentation ranging over a range of issues. Are you staying around for a few minutes?
I can't, I'm afraid. I have another meeting this afternoon.
Okay. Well, thanks very much.
No, it was my pleasure. Thank you.
Indeed to Tom Burke for his presentation.